Start recording. We're recording. Okay, so this is the fifth of six Data Together reading groups, and this week the topic is privacy. And so what we usually do, because we don't all know each other, or I think it hasn't worked out yet that we've all known each other, is that we do a brief round of intros and names, and then we'll kind of use the notepad we have to kind of surface some themes and questions we want to discuss from the readings, and then kind of spend the substantive amount of the hour and a half we have together talking about it. I think there'll be a little bit of a wrap-up conversation and maybe a couple other slightly off-topic but data together things to talk about at the end, so we might give ourselves like a little more time than we usually do, maybe 10-15 minutes, just to like transition and give ourselves that space. So I'm gonna ask two things. First, is someone able to take notes? Cool, thanks, Matt. And oh, I wasn't sure if that was like a laptop balancing gesture. And then maybe can I ask people to introduce themselves? Doesn't have to be too in-depth, but maybe if you want to say where you're based to, in the order that I see you. So I see Eric and then Rob.
Hi everybody, I'm Eric Knott. I've been involved with Edgy for a while now, and I'm based in Guelph, Ontario.
I'm Rob Brackett. I float around and work on some of the software tools for web monitoring for Edgy, and I am based in San Francisco.
And then I see Matt P. and then Matt Z. together.
I'm Matt. I live in Toronto. I've been working with Edgy for a while, mostly with archiving now for the last long while, and I teach history and philosophy of science and science studies. And I'm just a little slow getting started on the notes because I lost my place and the document's so damn long. I'll be there soon.
Zomwald. I'm in Philadelphia. I work at Protocol Labs on IPFS and a bunch of other projects, including Data Together.
So next I see Song Young and then Rico.
Hi, I'm Song. I live in New Zealand and I work with Jeremy on a archival nonprofit.
Hey everybody, I'm Rico. I work at Query in Brooklyn, New York, and I'll be standing in for Brendan today, who's on his way out.
Then I see the other Edgy and Kevin.
Hi, I'm Kelsey, logged into the Edgy account. I'm the new archiving PM, and I'm still getting used to the Zoom thing, but I'm located near Seattle.
Hey everyone, I'm Kevin. I'm Edgy's community coordinator. I'm in San Diego. I'm also at the library, so I'm not going to be talking too much.
And last but not least, Jeremy, and then I'll say my name.
Hi, I'm Jeremy. I work with Sung with Benimer Labs.
And yeah, I'm Dawn. I'm based in Toronto, doing stuff with Edgy and Data Together. Okay, so as I said, I put in those 3 high-level themes from the readings that we did, but I wondered if maybe we wanted to take a step back and just like not dig into those first and kind of maybe have people say what they thought at a high level, and then see if we could collect some more or questions that were kind of guiding them into this week or that they came out of the readings from. And maybe just the frame I want to give us all is the fact that we probably didn't have a very strong frame around this week. I think our like intro is like, we've been hearing critiques about privacy, both as a concept or as being presented as a moral imperative. Like, do they make sense? And we're then also talking about, in this kind of space of like data together and think about decentralization, and I think Edgy's work as well. So yeah, maybe were there specific questions that people kind of were hoping to get out of the readings and or would like to chat about today? And then the second question is, from the readings, do you have questions directly? So it's like, what were you coming in with? What did you leave the readings with? And I'm happy to keep stack, but it's been usually pretty casual. So like I would say also feel free to jump in. And then if there's a lot of us, I'll make sure we don't forget people.
I guess I could start somewhere. I guess it seems like this is almost unfathomable about where to start. So I was thinking about some of the ways that media theorists often talk about privacy and what they set it up in contrast to, and they're usually there's this linear connection that they construe between something that's like privacy and secrecy. So you have like a point, an endpoint, and another endpoint, and you draw a line between them, and you say that it becomes a scale where you put something on one end and it tips it, or you put something on the other end, it tips it the other way. And I was thinking more along the lines of something more like persistence recently, in terms of the difference between perpetuity and persistence in how this really, there's a lack of any nuance about this in the vernacular, including in academic writing, about the notion that there are different gradations of what persistent really can mean in different contexts, and that this I think can dissolve a lot of the linguistic like confusions of talking about privacy, where maybe it's okay for, maybe the users would consent to have the data available up to an expiry, or and so they can use it in the interim, but that they don't want it to stick around like indefinitely, and so forth. And I was thinking about how the contrast is really between in the writing, it's between the assumption that you either have complete control or you have zero control in all cases all the time. And this seems like it's so unsophisticated or hard to map to anything that might be a better hybrid system that it's hard to work with.
Yeah, so it sounds like related to that, like Song dropped those sort of kind of concepts that came out of, I think that's Jill Lepore's reading. So privacy, secrecy, mystery, obfuscation, coming out of Finn Brunton's and Helen Nissenbaum. I definitely think there's something really interesting to directly build on what you said, Jeremy, about kind of like the way that these concepts are put up against each other or held in relation to each other, maybe both in academic texts or by theorists, but then also I think in popular understanding. Now, I would love to spend more time talking about, because I think some of the arguments might be about changing those relationships to each other, or like understanding the history of those relationships. Any other thoughts? Go, Matt Zed.
Well, the first reading, the updating to remain the same, was really challenging for me. Just like it was it was very dense, and with lots of like references to other stuff that I hadn't necessarily read, and sort of she would sort of slide between lots of clearly very rich conversations that must exist in the literature that I'm not exposed to. So there are a bunch of concepts in there that I would love to get a little bit of help unpacking them. Like there's this whole section in the intro where she digs into the notion of habit, and she's like, habit is really popular now. and it's like, really? So there's that. She like has this provocative comment of a network's personal computer is an oxymoron, which I think would be a rich thing to unpack. And then she proposes this politics of forgiveness, which applies to the things that we were talking about, this idea of it sort of connects with right to be forgotten, but from a different perspective. But it didn't seem to land in what I read. I didn't read the whole book. I only read the recommended portions. And so I'm curious of like, where was she going there? And do people know more about what's going on there? So yeah, that basically after reading that one, I came away with a lot of questions and kind of wanted to reread the whole thing a couple more times.
Go Rob and then Eric.
Yeah, I guess I felt really similarly about a lot of that one actually. And there were a bunch of other ones I thought were provocative. Like she had a note that basically was saying that open source software is bad, in that it's contributing to like a sense of like everything must be licensed in a bad understanding of public domain, which I also thought was super interesting in there, even though it was way apart from points about privacy. But that like jumped out at me as an argument I hadn't really heard before. And also like in the main reading from there, that fourth chapter, like I think like Matt, I felt like it was very dense and I had trouble getting a whole lot out of most of it, except for the portion around the right to loiter stuff. And then like she had some sort of immediate recommendations following that. But then when she reached back into like the resolution after that, it returned to like the density and language where I felt like I was having trouble pulling much out of it. So yeah, I guess I had a lot of similar thoughts and questions in there. But also in that part, well, I'll raise my hand again if I can find what I was thinking. I've lost my train of thought there.
So I'll just say a little bit about where I'm coming from. I think the discussion around privacy and broader public discourse has been really hard for me. I realize it's such an important concept, but it's always been hard for me to latch onto it for many reasons and that I've thought a lot about. But so I'm really interested in these conversations and trying to work through why it's been hard for me. But more specific to the readings, I thought they were really interesting, really rich, as everybody's pointing out. There's 3 or 4 questions that I'd really be curious to dive into today. And the first echoes Rob's point about the first reading, Wendy Chun's question or idea of loitering online and what that would mean. I agree. It's kind of, at least in the readings we did, it's presented and then backed off, and maybe she fleshes it out elsewhere. I'd just be really curious to talk about what that would look like more concretely, which follows the second point. So I also read the Brown chapter on surveillance and blackness, and I think he raises a really interesting, or they raise a really interesting idea of the airport as like a critical pedagogical space, I think is the term they use. And as a site where both commercial, airline, takes place, and also a site of surveillance, but also a place where people can learn about these things and actually critically engage with them. And so the question there for me is like, how does that translate from the physical space in an airport to the less physical virtual space? And then finally, the third kind of big question for me is, I forgot. There's only 2 questions. I forgot the third one.
It'll come back. Drop it in the chat or jump in again. I see Rob's hand, so maybe Rob has remembered a thing.
Yeah, I remembered what I wanted to say, but only if nobody else had stuff they wanted to jump in with. I guess it's just so the other part that so after the right to loiter part in Habit 1, the sort of recommendations and facts she was starting to get to that got to me, and also drove back to Jeremy was mentioning this sense of storage and memory which she talked about a lot. And I was having trouble making that make sense to me until she got to this point where what she ultimately seemed to be saying was that sort of one aspect of spaces that we need that would be more healthy online are ones that don't persist in that way, where, and it seemed to be saying something to me about we have all these ideas around like wanting more asynchronous communication and ways for people to review stuff and say things later, but maybe that is actually a damaging idea, which I thought was very interesting, and especially plays in interesting with concepts of archival and that sort of thing.
I'm wondering if other folks maybe have thoughts or questions or ideas that they want to raise. I can maybe say this by way of slight filler. I think when we were conceiving of this month's reading group, we actually wanted to kind of pull in or pull directly on alternative accounts of the thing that is now described by privacy, or like people who are making a case for other ways of doing it. And the right to loiter was one of those. And that was sort of an explicit thing that we wanted to draw into conversation a little bit with a little bit more depth of kind of like, where does this notion of privacy and right to privacy come from? And just to clarify too about whether or how much stuff, and then Kelsey to you, whether or not or how much this gets addressed, I don't think it's any more addressed in the rest of the book, The Right to Loiter. I've heard her speak and expand on it a little more, but I couldn't find an article where it had been more thoroughly articulated. So it might be something that's sort of pretty contemporary in her thoughts, and so maybe still being worked through. Anyway, Kelsey.
So I've been hesitant to speak because I was surprised by the reading selections. I guess I was expecting more of a conversation around like what must be transparent, what should be transparent, surveillance of individuals, and it comes across a lot more, not exactly tangential, but for example, Brown's piece on being Black in airports, it's a different kind of privacy conversation, I guess, that didn't seem to fit to me with the same like concept as the women in Mumbai loitering on the streets. You can sort of see a connection, but there didn't seem to be an obvious thematic thing that carries over, and then also the piece on obfuscation. And I don't know, I ended up coming away from it confused on, well, does this just mean that the field of privacy is so huge that it touches all these things, and I can't find a way to unify them other than I agree that they are related? So I'm kind of curious to hear, well, from all the rest of you too, but what you thought about trying to connect these pieces into a whole, because it was so hard for me.
That actually feels like maybe a good way to start. So I'm wondering if we could save that question, but kick off with that question. I feel like Matt said is really stoked to answer it.
I'm really stoked to chime in.
Yeah. So maybe if there's any other burning things that people want to surface at the top, we have like a couple moments now. And Eric, to your third question, maybe let's, privacy.
Yeah, we can come back to it or not get to it, but I just thought
I think that might be a good one to kind of thread into how Jeremy was sort of thinking about the relationship of these different concepts, like persistence as well, to sort of like a core one of privacy. So why don't we start with like a bit of a reflection of like an answer to Kelsey's question. And I would say if a few of us want to answer it, or all of us, that would be awesome, because I think I'm really curious to hear what we all have to say. maybe Matt said you can kick us off because you're ready to go.
Yeah, well, it also just reminded me of like as I was reading that first reading, I was sort of resolving of wanting to arrive on this call just saying thank you. This reading group as a whole has been so amazing, but to have this stuff arranged where I arrived, because I work in this space where we're developing protocols, privacy comes up in my work environment in this very literal sense, and it's very like technical and it's kind of simplistic and straightforward. And so to enter into this reading with someone saying, well, privacy is this slippery cultural construct, and well, culture is this slippery thing, and just like drag you into this space of like, hold on a second, think more deeply about all of this stuff, and like don't run with your assumptions of what privacy means, and don't run with your assumptions about what the context is that's happening around that. And it was really, it was not easy for me I was not expecting that, so it sort of shook me, but it was very refreshing to look back on this whole topic. So I like to echo Kelsey's like feeling confused. I just more like appreciate that confusion because I think it's well placed, and so bravo for choosing that mix. So I don't have any answers, more just, yeah, I hear you.
Go Matt P.
So I think listening to everybody, it feels like this topic is an opportunity to reflect on something that normally is just the kind of almost invisible bedrock on which we ground our actions and ideas, right? So like human rights is an idea that we all take for granted. Human rights are good. Sometimes, however, it's useful to interrogate the notion of human rights and think about how they maybe how that framework constrains the possibility of justice in certain circumstances or whatever. So I think here, like maybe the question that we should be posing ourselves is, what do we miss or fail? What do we miss, or what structures do we leave up uninterrogated when we take privacy for granted as when we take it for granted as a value? And I think the kind of like historical unpacking is, mostly comes out of a tradition of thinking about privacy as a concept and a set of practices that arise historically, along with the rise of liberalism in the 18th and 19th centuries, and that that there are a bunch of bad things about privacy, and where I sort of was most struck by that, the image that I thought was most helpful in Chun was the image of the window, right? Where, so when she's talking about the window, she's saying, when we say that privacy is really important, we're taking for granted this division between the sacrosanct individual and the public sphere, which is outside, or the public realm, which is outside of us. And, there are other ways to imagine our relationships to society. Like, it might also be, for instance, that society is constitutive of who we are, as opposed to a kind of free relationship into which we enter by choice. So I think the suggestion is that when we organize our technical and political efforts around privacy, that we might be kind of instantiating a notion of what it is to be a person that is kind of messed up and misses big parts of who we are or who we'd like to be, or something like that. So that doesn't answer anybody's question, but I think it kind of is a ground for the for some of the conversations that the authors are having.
Go Song, and then I'll go after.
Yeah, so I think for basically all of the readings that we've done so far, I've sort of identified a shared theme or a shared set of questions. And I think it's primarily the paradoxes introduced by what neoliberalism does to the way we view I guess, networked life. Like Matt was saying, I think the liberal ontology of what individuals are, or even the fact that it perceives of human beings as individuals rather than constituents of a different individual. So maybe prior to the liberal ontologies, there were other kinds of social entities that were prioritized as the primary individuals, like communities. I think in one of the readings they talk about how privacy is a very different kind of thing in very small village societies and so on. And Wendy Chun in her book constantly talks about the economization of social life and relationships and so on as a result of neoliberalism. And I thought that maybe she could have taken it in a different direction, where instead of talking about how it's all turning us into kind of the stereotypical rational agents in a dog eat dog economy, its real imperative isn't turning the economic into the ethical, but turning the epistemological into the ethical, as in its entire justification is saying that the more we turn individuals, or the more we cram individuals into its preconceived ontology of nodes separate from other nodes that can be connected together by exposing their data, we can. So sorry, I've lost my train of thought a little bit, but what I'm saying is that its self-justification is that it thinks the more we know about each other, the more rationally we can mutually benefit off transactions, and it's trying to force human relationships and human self-perceptions into this particular set of very artificial view on what humans and relationships are. And it's primarily about knowledge rather than economic self-interest.
Okay, so my attempt to maybe answer your question, Kelsey, and this is like maybe also like me tipping my hand because I chose all the readings. So sorry. Was I actually kind of thought about each one as sort of trying to do a similar move to like this sort of group of concepts that are kind of close, which is like privacy and then surveillance, like the sort of privacy and like privacy versus like the public, or sort of that relationship. And then also kind of thinking about the way that people who are like kind of more on the like crypto cypherpunk, crypto libertarian sort of angle think about like resistance to or like ensuring privacy remains, or like resisting surveillance. And so like I thought a lot of what each of these were doing, though probably obfuscation the least, was kind of bringing in conversation a set of ideas, or even a way of thinking about these topics, which are not frequently there. So I want to kind of acknowledge that like I don't think that these are like the dominant views of like how people write about any of these topics. But they're kind of, I think in many ways, kind of pitching themselves as being an intervention or a corrective to kind of what's missing from those conversations in some ways explicitly like whereas I think Wendy Chun is, and maybe Simone Brown's as well, her work around surveillance and trying to like link that to like a history of anti-Blackness. So maybe that's like my way of weaving them together. I thought that it actually gave me a lot to think about around the relationship of these different concepts to each other. But I also kind of want to acknowledge or think a little more about like, there is such a dense network of references that are going on. I would say probably the most in Chun, but also Brown's work, that it can be hard, like it's hard for me to read those without knowing a lot of, like not all of them, certainly miss most of them, but I don't know how to read without automatically making those connections. So I don't know if people got out of it something, like I got a lot out of it that was probably off to one side based on what I've read before. I see Jeremy.
All right, so I was thinking back to the alternative characterizations of or grounding for different exegetical interpretations of what has come to be known as privacy in modern life, and there's a lot of this. I don't really know exactly what tack to take here, but there's a lot of emphasis in several different. You see different versions of it, but it's a lot of emphasis in various texts on the historical development of the domestic sphere and secular Western civ in opposition to or in usurpation of God-fearing Mysterianism, where the right to a certain privileged class, like the nobleman or just the king, to hold certain things sacrosanct and secret was what was the privacy of the monarch or et cetera. And then you have this running thread of, well, technology always precedes. What was the money quote about technology always? I think it was from the New Yorker article. I can't remember. Technology always preceding the development of an interest in developing privacy process. And so there's this progressive arc of technology being used to usurp that which someone wanted to deprive the commoner of previously. And so there's this deprivation, and then transcending that, and then having fallout, and then rinse and repeat. And there's this process that's construed as occurring, starting from the defeat of God or something like that. And I'm not necessarily sold on that. I mean, that's useful to know for historical purposes about where the words come from and where the ideas come from, especially in terms of what the pursuit of modern ideals as a thing that was grounded in the formation of modern states, for instance. But how applicable are those notions to a post all of those things, a post medieval society where people, when they hear privacy, they think, well, it's exclusive to me, or someone else can't see it. They may not have a particular distinction or specific contrast between secrecy and privacy in their own life. So I was kind of, I don't know, beached on that.
Yeah, I think that's actually maybe a good transition, as you see me saying in the chat, to maybe just spending a bit of time and probably kicking off from, but you're right, it's sort of touched on by all of them, but Jill Lepore's article, and sort of thinking through or just reflecting on what we took from that as sort of the history of privacy, and maybe Matt providing some context around liberalism and public sphere. because I think it's there in the wings, but not really heavily treated by Jill Lepore. And maybe to your question, Jeremy, about you kind of maybe got beached at that point and weren't sure how applicable it was. I kind of think that's a question to put to all of us, but I would say, yeah, some of that, like thinking about the sort of secularization of mystery as like this first sight of privacy, maybe feels like it might be a little distant for how I'm going to contemporarily like make snap judgments around these things. Yet, having an undergrad in history, I tend to really favor like these historical kind of contexts. It feels like they layer or like add like a lineage or like allow you to trace back where an idea comes from, because it's sort of always so striking to me the way we use concepts and think we're using them in the way they've always been used without kind of attending to the shifts over time, which can be really helpful to sort of like even maybe speak to how they're not working for us now, or how we want to sort of steer the direction of how they're being used currently. And I found that really has been helpful for me to think about privacy, particularly in a much more recent example, not so far back, with this sort of notion of like where the right to privacy came from, which I think was actually probably referenced in every one except for the obfuscation piece. Wow, I feel like I'm not pronouncing that word right every time I say it. But was most concretely addressed in the Lepore article. Though I put also a little snippet from the Wikipedia article page about it in the top of our notes today that I kind of just wanted to point to, because this is sort of, I think, long been known within legal scholarship. So there's a couple famous articles about where privacy came from, or sort of analysis by scholars, and kind of like focus on the material conditions that went into producing that judgment, or that sort of initial articulation, including like basically paparazzi and like front page newspaper coverage of like this one Warren, one of the judge's funerals, but then also I think in particular this like intense media coverage of a wedding, and sort of like covering it as like social, like the society section news. I don't know if anyone wants to sort of say something now or speak a bit about kind of what they took from that or what was surprising, or also Matt, if you want to talk about public sphere and or liberalism in this context, that might be a good like kickoff for us all to kind of talk about that.
Yeah. So should I hold forth for a little bit?
Unless someone has a strong thought.
So I think there are kind of two or three strands that of historical thinking that inform all this writing. On the one hand, there is work into the history of everyday life from the mid 20th century, where Anglo-American, especially Anglo-American historians, but not only, start to kind of expand the reach of what history is supposed to be about, instead of just about, guys who ran countries and fought wars and stuff. There's a variety of new different topics that are being explored, and one of them is what was life like for ordinary people. And so especially the effort among feminist historians to get some kind of a handle on what it was like to be a woman meant that people had to explore how the spheres of activity of men and women came to be seen as fundamentally different. So that's like one historiographical tradition. And there you see, classically, the idea that the private sphere emerges as a feminine sphere in the mid 19th century or the early 19th century. And that before that, we had a different set of divisions that governed life. And then there are like in the European philosophical tradition, there are two main thinkers who frame this stuff. One is Habermas, who is, the last student of the Frankfurt School in Germany post-war. He writes in 1962 this book called The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, Die Strukturwandlung der Öffentlichkeit, in which he claims that the idea of a public realm is kind of a new idea at the end of the 19th century. And he spends a lot of time talking about Kant, about the way Kant understood the distinction between public and private, and how it related to Kant's epistemology, like most of Kant's philosophical work, and also to Kant's politics. And he thinks that the idea that there should be a place where ordinary people can come together and express their opinions and be judged only on the basis of those opinions and arguments, as opposed to on the basis of who they are. That, first of all, was a pretty new idea in the late 18th century. And second, that it was one of the fundamental conditions that enabled democratic societies to arise. And that without this idea of a rational public sphere, you can't really have a democracy. And a rational public sphere requires certain kind of conduct and also and a certain kind of speech. So you have to be willing to listen to anyone. You have to ensure that your judgment of their actions, of their arguments, is only about the arguments, not about who they are, and so forth. And he called this the authentic public sphere. And then he said that the public sphere sort of runs down. It kind of peaks in around the French Revolution, before and then right after the French Revolution, and then it degrades. And that is related for him in this kind of slightly Marxist materialist way to something, a kind of dynamic internal to the news media. That the news media at the beginning of the period that he's studying are incredibly powerful forces for good. And then the kind of capitalist dynamic that structures the news media brings about their own degradation, so that by the early 20th century, they're kind of a force destroying the authentic public sphere. And this is this kind of like, we all kind of participate in some piece of that when we look at the media and say, oh my God, it's getting worse and worse. So that's, for Habermas, the distinction between public and private was really, really important. And it not only did it become important historically, but philosophically, it was an essential thing that we had to hang on to. And then Foucault, right, who like practically got into a fist fight with Habermas the one time that they were on TV together, devoted a lot of his later work to trying to figure out where the idea of the private sphere comes from and what kind of work it's doing to stabilize society. So he's working kind of at a different level from Habermas. So it seems to me that all this historical work draws on one or more of those three strands. And this is also actually related to habit, kind of. That's a long story, but the notion of habitus, which Bourdieu takes, of course, from Aristotle and from Latin language philosophers, is kind of a kind of long lost twin of Foucault's idea of discipline. And I mean, I have a dissertation chapter about it. So if I were to talk about it, I guess it wouldn't be that short. But I think when Sean is talking about habit, here's the thing that I think is is useful is that the kind of pragmatist tradition that from James and Dewey, who she mentions, James was a psychologist. He spent a lot of time thinking about how the mind works, and habits was one of his, one of his principal categories for thinking about the mind. And when Dewey says that habits are the action of the world through the mechanism of our biology, he's saying, and this is a kind of pragmatist view, that the world comes into us through our habits, which means that we are not individuals. We are part of the world, or the world is part of us. And so when we make some kind of a claim to an absolute separation between the sphere that belongs properly only to me alone, the private sphere, we're misunderstanding what we are, which is to say we are products of the world we live in, as opposed to like Leibnizian monads that are parachuted into the world and then act as we see fit. I don't know. I hope that was sort of clarifying.
Song next, and then Matt said.
Yeah. Oh man, there's so much stuff in there. I was so excited hearing it. Where should I start? Yeah, I was very curious about so Habermas and was another one like Hannah Arendt. The kinds of deliberative democracy advocates, like quite recently, I think because of the neoliberal era, it's like the deliberative democracy has really taken a hit in terms of being feasible on a very large scale, and it seems to be bringing back both the kinds of highly insular xenophobic tendencies where people, I think in one of the readings, not in a specified section, they mention things like very aggressively hostile sub-communities that exist purely as the result of kind of like shunning a particular section of society or something, and it justifies itself based on trying to go against this this elimination of private communities, and it seems like on the larger scale, the deliberative public sphere where everyone can come together and just be heard for what kinds of ideas they're sharing is starting to become too overloaded to really work, and so it's really driven out the for example, like the Deweyan conception of the individual as part of the community and as a kind of growth process intimately connected to the rest of the world has been driven out, and everything's been replaced by like the little monad view of the individuals. And so I'm wondering whether obfuscation as a strategy against that really gives us an out in terms of protecting alternative ways of viewing and living life as something other than just a discrete particles in a big single economy, or whether it's sort of like only palliative rather than really fundamentally doing anything about it.
That's such a great question. I want to wonder if you're okay if we sit on that for a second, and I maybe have the last move after a little bit more into that sort of like thinking about the alternative ways offered from all of these people, including obfuscation, and kind of get to your question a little more. Unless Matt Zed is directly responding to it, which I think probably is not, then let's turn to Matt Zed.
That's a different question.
Yeah, but yes, I want to talk about that.
So I thank you for all that context, Matt. It still just makes me want to go and read all of that stuff in order to and actually absorb it myself. One thing in Chun's article, she also in one point goes into how the new media and the way that we communicate through networks is sort of this ultimate tool of neoliberal, of like executing a neoliberal universe or way of making the world operate, and how that transforms the individual into, see, this is where I'm a little bit lost on what she was pointing out, but that it transforms the role of privacy and the role of the individual with respect to this larger system. And maybe I could go dig it up. It's just I see there's a kind of a collision there of the evolution of the conversations from Habermas and others around the public sphere and the private sphere. And then you have this complete transformation of the economics and the behavior and the actual means of communication that just flips it all on its head. And she was particularly pointing a finger at neoliberalism and Milton Friedman as like instigators of that. Is there more to that there? Is there like critical discussion there that you're aware of? Or could you even clarify for me?
Yeah, sure. I think that is part of a big, long conversation about, you know, this word neoliberalism is a lot of things, right? Because so quite narrowly, we can think of it as a set of economic, arguments that arise in the 1970s and then are instantiated in policy. But there's a big critical, when it's deployed in the way it is here, it's because there's a large critical conversation that links those economic theories to a whole slew of social transformations, which are in some way sometimes like materially linked to the economic theories. So, like we talk sometimes about like the world of structural adjustment, right? Where neoliberal theories made certain predictions about how you fix problems of, say, corruption or inefficiency in third world countries. Structural adjustment imposes that view, and as a result, changes the social and political conditions and the kind of possibilities that are open to individuals in the societies that are subject to structural adjustment. So that's like a kind of fairly material argument, but I think that she's using it in a much more kind of multiply derived way, if that's fair. Maybe someone else should say something about
it. I'll just say that I think that the core of where she's making that argument is on 10 through 12, page 10 through 12 in the intro, unless I'm wrong. And I would agree that it's like a stacked drawing also on what like the work that other people have done with the word neoliberalism that you kind of connect to at times. I don't know if the whole argument worked for me, so I'll just say like I wasn't totally sold on all of it, but I thought that there was like pointers along the way. So it kind of, I think her, but also Jill Lepore kind of talk about this sort of like a way that things get in like kind of like inverted, or like a transformation that happens to like what privacy means, that I think is like interesting to point out. And when she flags it in that article where she's arguing about neoliberalism, sort of below the space that the quote that I put there, is that she makes this comment about like how there was there was this way that like you were in this subject position of like maybe being as bourgeois to like denigrate a previous form of private while rarefying like a new version of it. But that like what happened in that process was that people, certain people were left out or became able to access privacy. Like I think there's something in there that was kind of interesting. And so she was sort of trying to make a reference, I think, to the position of like how slaves were treated and like what privacy meant before versus like who was able to claim privacy when it kind of got reified as this more like bourgeois like sort of concept. But I didn't kind of take the argument to its full conclusion as being like particularly one I want to hold on to. Maybe Matt P. I don't know, Jeremy, if you want to add anything from your comment as well in the chat.
I just wanted to mention that it's very difficult, especially among, or not among, but when reading social theorists' works, people who are their social networks and their information networks and their academic networks they're not perfectly aligned, and everyone, to a certain extent in their writing on anything that involves some sort of social component does some level of, they pick and choose very carefully the signaling words around which they define their framework of their argumentation. And it's very hard to parse out what a lot of the uses of certain seemingly descriptively like economic terms now mean in those contexts. Like neoliberalism can mean more or less pejorative things. The valence that's associated with the term is almost like, it's almost visceral in certain spheres where it's like neoliberalism and it's this scapegoat term that just means anything bad. And some people are using it to mean sort of the original sense of the term. And so when talking about like the neoliberal condition and things like that, I often have no idea what's actually being described. And that makes it very hard to pair up writing that refers to these things. So I just wanted to point out that that's an ongoing problem.
I mean, I think you're right that the way I wrote it in the notes, that a lot of this talk is just virtue signaling, So sometimes we use the word neoliberal just to let people know that we're on the right side or whatever. I wanted to say that I think the thing that makes the argument that you described, Matt, difficult, the argument that these new media construct the neoliberal world order somehow. I think what's frustrating about that argument is, on the one hand, some lack of clarity about what neoliberal means, but on the other hand, like an assertion that technologies just have this power, this intrinsic power, and that they, once you have a Facebook, you can only have a neoliberal world order afterwards, because Facebook will turn us all into neoliberals or something like that. And to me, that seems like too reductive or simplistic a view of how technology works, like how it interacts with the rest of the world, like not that technologies, I think that the claim guns don't kill people, people kill people is stupid. But on the other hand, you can do more than one thing with a gun. You can be a fascist or a communist or a liberal Democrat with a gun. So anyway, we should just think. I think that's the other grating thing about that claim that she made.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so that's something that's very hard to articulate, is that I get the sense, I really am struck by a kind of determinism, a relativism that is bordering on determinism in a lot of the way that technology is construed to be effectively manufacturing from tabula rasa beings their entire inner life, because it almost begs the question of whether they have one. And in a lot of this this discussion, to posit that technology doesn't interact with the formation of norms or the development of, in a diachronic sense, of ideals and values and different community patterns, it's baldly wrong. But to lean into the idea that technology is effectively like imprinting itself onto inside the skull of those who use it, it seems completely stripping away the possibility of an internal life that is independent of the use of an app that didn't exist a year ago, or the use of a mobile device that didn't exist 10 years ago. Even though life would go on for all the people who currently have those things if they were to just be taken away or to disappear overnight as if by magic. And so that's another problem with the all-encompassing scope of the use of the neoliberal order type of rhetoric for me, is that it seems like it's reductionist in a way that deprives people who are not hip to the lingo from having the capacity to have a world view, a model of the world and their place in it that has depth and is in some way customized to them, which is clearly not correct. So that's something that is difficult here, I think.
Thank you. I think that was like I think that was a good way to try and unpack some of the currents, maybe also behind these ideas, but also giving a summary of some of the things driving what the authors were discussing. I'm wondering if, given the amount of time we have left, as I said in chat, we might want to start to turn towards kind of what I didn't have a good title for in my head, but kind of this theme of what alternative ways are suggested. So I think that recalls Song's comment about is obfuscation a potential tactic, and is it palliative or is it emancipatory? I don't think you used the word emancipatory, but I was trying to think of an opposite. And or also recalling all the way back to the beginning, I think Rob and others kind of wanting to dig in or settle in a little more to this notion of right to loiter, and that's sort of those immediate suggestions that came after its introduction. I think that maybe I will invite, but this is not a requirement. Song, if you're interested, would you be cool giving a bit of a synopsis of the obfuscation, this word and me, argument, or what you took from it before kind of reposing your question, and then we might kind of start there?
Yeah, so in Wendy Chin's book, she basically makes the argument that obfuscation is a weapon that can be utilized even in the extreme, even under the extremely individuating and disempowering heels of neoliberalism that forces everyone to kind of expose what they're up to, and makes it impossible for them to, I suppose, conspire against the powers that be, and that people in the most disadvantaged positions can utilize it to hide their tracks when they're trying to fight the system by. So what she says is that the society and the system can be changed by changing our habits, even as the system tries to change our habits in order for us to better fit its own self-perpetuating imperative. And I had a brief look at one of her earlier books, from I think 2011, and she's much more hesitant to say these sorts of things because she's wary of how much like a one-way mirror things like user interfaces and so on that facilitate interactions between the nodes seem to be. But now in the 2016 book, it seems that she sees them more like windows that paradigmatically characterizes the neoliberal conception of the individual. And then she goes on to extrapolate a more hopeful view about the so what did you say, liberatory?
Emancipatory.
Yes, thank you. Emancipatory potential of obfuscation as a political tactic. And I'm wondering whether she's being a bit too optimistic here.
Maybe too, I'll just maybe not answer your question, but just extend or link it to how I was struck by something similar from Brunton's that chapter. Which I feel like I read as I read it really fast and like crunched it in my brain. So I have like this only one kernel that I took away from it, but I liked the kernel, which was, I think, kind of a recognition of an asymmetry. So sort of that big, like that many nation states, private companies are kind of not, their ability to act or the modes upon which they act are so different. And so trying to understand against that asymmetry, what tactics you could adopt, and sort of to understand that, I think they were sort of using obfuscation as like this kickoff point, and in the book document these, like, they have like a list that's kind of like presented as like examples, but also kind of like tactics, but they're kind of not really that separate. There was like a way that they put what they're doing kind of alongside this, I think was a sociologist, Scott, who talked about this notion of like, okay, for people who have no power, like what are the moments of everyday resistance? And he kind of gave them this name, weapons of the week, to kind of encapsulate those gestures or sort of actions that happen without power. And then also, I think, was sort of referencing someone else who I'm not less familiar with, who apparently writes about surveillance, Gary Marks. And they kind of he had like given these two like sort of modes as like his way of describing it. So one being like resistance, and one being sort of like preserving or retaining or taking back autonomy. And so they're kind of just like trying to think about like, and in terms of the explicit tactics of like obfuscation, they mentioned like hosting Tor relays, the way that there's these like browser extensions that people use that would do these like click bombs of like giving like thousands of like false searches when you make a search. Some of them have been actually staged as like art interventions or as well, or kind of performances, but yeah, I'm rambling, so I'll stop. And Jeremy has a hand raised, so maybe Jeremy, but then Kelsey, and I don't know, Eric, if you had a thought.
Hi, so I wanted to directly interrogate Matt Z, if you didn't mind, about in relation to the seeming what I think of as maybe only the good kind of interrogation, not the enhanced kind. What I see is like a false tension between two maybe not necessarily cohesive or easily meshed ways of talking about stuff like privacy and security and secrecy, which is the mechanistic view that pertains to pragmatic concerns of like the proximate means of technology, like end-to-end encryption and the UX of secure messengers that makes it so that either people who are less familiar with technology can use them or can't. The ways that the things that are listed in the obfuscation, the rundown of things. How it seems like so I mean, that book, I believe, is the one that describes a future vision of where getting yourself on lists is as a result of some sort of activity like running a Tor relay or something is it's awaiting us all. For me, that was actually like never a future. I mean, that's something that I ended up finding myself a situation in from the time I was a kid. So I don't. For me, I always have this very extreme skepticism approaching like stuff like the Wendy Chung texts, the general, the media theorist sphere, like the Lovink sphere, where they're talking in this abstract way. They're trying to abstract away from the details forcefully, and I'm thinking that's how you get pwned. I'm thinking like that's how you get people who want things to be safe, who don't necessarily know how to do it. Lure them into a false sense of security. And so I am always frustrated by what seems to be, to me, two disparate ways of talking about things that overlap that might not be easy to mesh together and might not go together, but that are often sort of insinuated as being oppositional. And I wanted to ask you, Matt Z, basically, do you find it, I mean, at the end of the day or at the beginning of a day when you have to go and do something at work that you were talking about, you were saying it's very plain and it's about the ways that the system works. Do you get the sense that, like, are you thinking like Wendy Chung? Yes, I will draw upon the wisdom of Wendy Chung. And does it incorporate itself? I just don't know how to make these two things that are not necessarily at odds with each other, but that don't always go together, like mesh, especially given that the only direction in which I ever see any insinuations that the proximate concerns are not important, the only direction I ever see that coming from is the media theorist direction.
So in my immediate work, there's sort of two ends of a spectrum. That there's at the protocol design layer of things, a lot of it has to be being attentive to the power of default, right? So because email is not end-to-end encrypted by default in the design of the protocol, like if that was built in as the default of this is how the protocol works, then there wouldn't be the question of how do you convince like a couple billion people to use end-to-end encryption when Google makes it so easy to just use Gmail, and Google doesn't want it end-to-end encrypted because they want to analyze your emails, right? So there's this like hyper attentiveness at the design phase of what are the defaults that we're baking in here and what are the impacts on people's opportunities to act in the interest of their own, basically make their own decisions about what they want to be private or not private, depending on their definition of what privacy is, right? So it's on that end, sort of unconcerned about the media critic perspective and unconcerned about what Foucault had to say about habits, right? Because it's like, design these technologies so that they default to giving people the power to make the decisions that protect them. And when they are uninformed, it defaults to doing what is most likely to protect them in their interest. But then at that other layer, it's like, well, but how are those protocol designers supposed to magically know what's in the interest of those billions of potential users? So there's a tension there. At the other end of the spectrum, I sat in on a great discussion with people from like Electronic Frontier Foundation and Crypto Harlem and Tactical Tech, talking about the realities of teaching personal security, like internet security, to everyday people. And that when you talk to technologists, they're like, oh, it's all about end-to-end encryption and private key management, and private key management is hard, and that's the problem. When the people who are actually out there educating everyday people about how to protect themselves, it's more about broadening people's understanding of how the internet works at a basic level. Like when I send this message, or when I open a web browser and I go to a web page, what's happening and what are the flows of information there? And that if you don't understand that, then all the private keying management isn't going to save you, right? And so there's that basic use. A lot of engineers are like, oh, that's about user experience, but it's actually something broader about people being educated about how this whole system works. So then in between, I see the media theorists playing a role of when people are like, what exactly is happening here? How do I even have a foothold for starting to make sense of what's happening so that I can figure out how to move through that? That's where you need this deeper, richer perspective of like, oh, well, actually you're clashing up against identity and economics and all of those things. And you sort of, the more thoughtfulness you can bring to that, the richer your solution is going to be. That's how I think about it.
Okay, so just as a facilitating timekeeping point, we're at like 8:02, and I think we probably need 5 minutes to wrap up. Are people okay if we, are people okay to stick around 10 minutes over? Will anyone have to disappear? Okay, so then let's keep the stack and go to Eric and then, or I had Kelsey and then Eric, and then we'll talk about loitering and then give ourselves like a short wrap up housekeeping.
I just wanted to very briefly touch on in the obfuscation when it was talking about how people are arguing about how not okay it is to obfuscate your stuff because you're using resources. And I follow the argument about if it is hurting other users who are not obfuscating, that sure, I get that, that's ethical stuff. But it also seemed like there was some concern about, well, you're using the energy and resources of this company irresponsibly. And does that seem like an argument anyone would plausibly make to anybody here? Because like, I don't know, there's just so many servers running, holding data that nobody's using anymore. Like, we do that all the time. I mean, we're currently doing that. Like, this call is recorded, it's gonna sit on a server. And it just seemed crazy to me that anyone would even try to make an argument like that.
I mean, it doesn't seem crazy to me. Although, like, on the scale of things, it's definitely always one where you have to think of what's the scale of this resource wastage versus another, right? Like on the very big scale where there's a lot of conversation now about Bitcoin as an example of that, in a like real, directly very problematic example of it.
Eric, I think you had.
So I think this might lead us into the discussion around loitering and to Matt P's concern to get back to the question of privacy not to matter in the concrete social lives of the vulnerable. And it comes, actually, what I was thinking of, or my question really comes out of your synopsis and discussion, Dawn, around some of the other reading here. I think you mentioned something along the lines of like, you know, and talking about Scott and this Gary Marks author, like the difference between resistance and recovering autonomy. And to me, that sort of mapped onto what I see as a difference between obfuscation and the right to loiter, where they seem actually very different things in terms of what is being reclaimed, something more personal, something more just the broader public sphere. And I didn't read the obfuscation piece, so it seems like they're kind of hedging their claims here in terms of like when obfuscation is actually useful and when it may not be. So I'm sure that, you know, I look forward to actually reading it, but for those of you who read it, I'm just curious if there's actually something like if it is just resistance, a technique that could actually be used by state power and not just by individuals trying to avoid state power, whereas maybe the right to loiter is actually something that is more, I don't know, a more positive creation of a new way of relating to each other. That's just my sort of feel of what these two different ideas are getting at. But I haven't read the obfuscation article.
I'll give my take on it, but this is like a bit of a distant take from the article. I think you're saying what I feel in general about some of these like tactical, and now I think in the US political climate, resistance gestures or like the actions, in that I think they kind of don't break frames, so they stay within, they don't maybe significantly change like the sort of the operating landscape or like the structures that are kind of producing kind of what they're responding to. And I feel like I can speak to one or two of the examples that I know are kind of related and tied to some of their own projects. Like, so the ad nauseum browse, the extension with the false search thing, or clicking all the ads when you go to a page, so you are like not, you're seeding it with all this terrible data. Like, it turns out it's fairly trivial for Google mostly, but I mean any large enough ad network to like just like detect and then not count those. And so I think that there was like a Helen Nissenbaum did that with this other person whose name I'm forgetting right now. And when they were kind of talking through how the project actually functioned and worked over time, it was like staged as this, like a tactical kind of like move. But in terms of whether it's like effectual long-term, it sounded like there had kind of been a response that mitigated fairly quickly on the other side. And so then you're kind of in this dance of like, you know, tactic and response, or like, I don't know. I think it's like everyone's really into like Desserteau, and we all want to say tactics versus strategy right now. Like, or that's like a certain thing. And yeah, so that's my sense. But it kind of seems like Jeremy's comment in the chat is echoing something similar. I'm wondering if people had thoughts about maybe really specifically the kind of early suggestions that Chun made about the right to loiter. And Eric, to go back to your thought, like, do we think those offer like a suggestion or hint of something a little that kind of escapes that, like that gravity well of tactical response or something?
Can I just follow up on that really quickly to just concretize how I see them as different, right? So obfuscation is essentially you're in the public sphere, but you're not necessarily loitering. You've cast a cloak over yourself or something. Whereas the right to loiter is I mean, this is the image Chung gives us. You're out in the open. You've got all these different kinds of people out in the open, and you're claiming that space. So I see them as very different. And you know, I mean, she uses the example of women in Mumbai, but yeah, what does that look like in the online space?
Does someone have the suggestions ready to hand? I can fish through my PDF to find them, but if someone else might want to refresh our memory, that could be a good way to ponder, have a couple parting thoughts. Can I think these are the ones I have. Rob, maybe you go first, then I'll say if this is, I don't think it's better. Go.
You should go ahead. I mean, I have the page open and I had like a boatload of thoughts and notes I wrote all over it, but I don't know that I have anything cohesive to say. So I don't know. I felt like most of what she had to say there in terms of solutions directly after the right to loiter part revolves around, and I think I kind of mentioned this earlier on, this sense of, the way I read it, of needing to inject or frame technologies with a sense of presence, in that what we needed more of is a space where, in order to participate, you also have to be more present there. But you don't have to be present like you can be present as part of a large semi-anonymous crowd, but you're still there as a face that when you're speaking, somebody is reacting to, in a way, right? Like not exactly as a face, but and then also this sense that in order to enable that, we also have to be able to forget stuff. Like not everything has to be perfectly archived and participatable in later, because if that's the case, then you're able to sort of obfuscate your participation through time. And so I think those were like the two major things that I felt like she was saying there were in her other remediation that she talks about throughout the whole thing is this sort of sense of maybe also we need to learn to treat networked conversation as public. Like there is no private. There's degrees of publicity in it, but there is no person nobody else sees it sort of communication. And so we all have to reframe how we use and think about these technologies in that way. I feel like those are the sort of the three main things she was hitting on there, at least in my reading.
Given that we're over time, I don't want to shut down conversation, but I also don't want to hold too much of people's time. So I'm wondering if people have another thought or response to that, but sort of imagining we maybe have one or two more and then just do the tiny bit of housekeeping. Go, Matt Zed.
It's just sort of two things there. One of, there are ways that I could imagine peer-to-peer approaches being really useful for achieving that. But also I think there are plenty of ways in which people would say, oh, peer-to-peer will solve all of these problems, when actually it could just worsen the problem depending on how you use them and the sort of behaviors that develop around it and the patterns. So that's an interesting, like feeding that into a design challenge of how do you actually design the use of peer-to-peer or community Wi-Fi how do you actually change those flows such that you create a public space where people can loiter without it being a really simplistic interpretation. And then I've also just been reflecting on just like the whole conversation since this is actually the Data Together reading group. So thinking about the implications around data stewardship and like all of these topics specifically applied to data stewardship. I don't have an opinion there. I'm more just to touch on that in my mind. It feels right. So I'm sharing.
Maybe if anyone has as a way to connect or sees a connection to data stewardship here that they want to offer, but also if folks who haven't said anything, want to say anything about anything we talked about today, that's also totally fine. I'll just say that I also felt like I was not thinking about data for most of the time I was reading this. And then like this morning was like, oh, right, it's about the data. So I actually think that's kind of interesting given how close I usually stay to even academic articles that are like really concretizing data like they're at that granular level where they're trying to talk about everything as data, as opposed to, I think flows was sort of a term of art or a term that was used a couple times here. Okay, I will say that brings another reading group mostly to a close. And just thank everyone again for all of your thoughts, and maybe also generosity reading readings that are like a little bit intense, or maybe didn't initially strike you as something you wanted to. And the two housekeeping bits I wanted to say were one, and this is more of a Data Together thing, is that we said we would have a fall coordinating call, and I want to put the bug in everyone's ear that there is a fall data together coordinating call that we were imagining happening before December when we all get busy. So I just want to surface that as like a mid to end October, early November. And if people see a critical issue with that timeline, to let me, but also Kelsey, and I was going to say Matt Price, but he's gone, no. Because I think Matt Price and I will help facilitate the creation of the agenda for that, just because it's directly after the annual meeting. But yeah, mid to late October, early November. Any critical blockers? Okay, off after October, great. And then the other thing was I was actually going to hand this over to Matt Zed a little bit. We referenced this on the last call, and I totally forgot what we said, but people got really excited about having a conversation with one of the members of Protocol Labs Crack Legal team. I don't know the right word. And actually it was sort of maybe related a little bit, or could speak to things that came up around privacy. And we said after this reading group, we might want to sort of stage that conversation. So we have one left in October, unless I've totally misremembered things, which means we might think about on a similar pace or sooner having this call. And so I'm gonna just throw it to Matt Zed now if there's any more you want to add, and maybe give us some hints or help for how we could pin down a date.
Yeah, nothing much more to add. So this is Marvin Hamori, who's our general counsel at Protocol Labs, whose most of his career has revolved around net neutrality. He's been one of the main lawyers and sort of lobbyists advocating for net neutrality throughout the years, but has also dealt with a lot of stuff around privacy, such as representing Apple in the San Bernardino case where Apple refused to unlock the iPhone, someone's iPhone. And so, since we're talking about privacy and then justice on the next one, I thought it would be cool to invite him. He's super game for it. His response was, oh, well, I'm not really up on all the latest like writings on these topics, but if you want to chat, that sounds fun. So he seems very receptive to it, and we just have to send him an email and suggest some dates and narrow it down. He's also, his team has grown, so he's brought on some other people who might even be even more eager and even like with their own perspective. So it might actually be a couple of people from that team that we might pull in. And yeah, and I think it made sense to, rather than doing it between this one and the justice one, do it after we've covered the justice one. And I suspect that conversation will kick up a bunch of topics that we might want to then dig into, like actually arrange some reading around and do as future sessions.
Awesome. So it sounds like we're talking like a November timeframe, and then end October was the next one, so October 30th. And could I say maybe we spend a bit of time next time, like within the hour and a half, seeing if there's any key critical topics or questions that we want to have in that conversation, and that may have come from the readings today, if we have a chance to mull on them, and or the readings next week. Does that sound okay to folks? Okay, so then we'll aim for like a November, and maybe keeping the same time slot. We can check in if that would work with enough notice, but kind of have it be a way to cap off this sort of phase of the reading group. And so also the other thing that Matt Zed mentioned is, I think and we've been tracking it throughout, but any potential topics that we said at one point, oh, we should read in more to this, kind of maybe start surfacing those. Please feel free to like mention them during the next call, and maybe we'll try and do some collecting there, but also in the GitHub repo. I don't want to talk more because I'll just ramble and we're over time, but are there any critical parting thoughts that people want to throw all of our way, or are we good to? Okay, I'm gonna stop recording.